New England and Boston were in absolute chaos between 1962 and 1964. There was a serial killer on the loose and no one had any idea who it was. This man was targeting vulnerable women when they were least expecting it, using their kindness to his advantage and taking their lives in the comfort of their very own homes. The most terrifying part of all this was that we still don't know who it was, although we do seem to have a good idea. Let's get into today's story. Now quickly, just before we get into it, hi, my name is Ashley and I talk about crime, creepy, and unbelievable stories. So if that's your thing, don't forget to comment, like, subscribe. Check out my TikTok for a lot more content. I post on there 1, 2, even 3 times a day. Same username at HeebieJeebiesTV, and the link is in my description box. Alright, so let's get into the story. It was June 14th, 1962, when the Boston Strangler, as headlines would end up calling him, targeted his very first victim named Anna Slessers. She was at home going about her day, having absolutely no clue what was about to happen to her. At some point that day, a man entered her apartment, strangled her with a belt from one of her own robes. But that wasn't it. He had also violated Anna. It wasn't until the following day that her lifeless body was discovered by her very own son on the floor of her kitchen on her 3rd-story apartment. Just imagine, I don't know how he must have felt during this entire thing, but finding your own mother deceased in her home must have been extremely traumatic for this guy. Her son was also quite adamant that his mother, Anna, did not have any enemies, so it just didn't make sense that someone would purposely do this to his mother. But there was just one problem. There was no sign of a forced entry into her apartment. And if this was a robbery, essentially this meant that Anna either knew the person that did this to her or she had let them in on her own. Little did everyone know that this crime would mark the beginning of a horrifying killing spree that would last about 2 entire years in Boston. And just for reference, this is exactly the same amount of time we spent worrying about the pandemic. So just imagine a crazed lunatic on the loose in your city, taking the lives of vulnerable women when they were least expecting it. You have absolutely no idea who this is. You don't know when they're going to strike. And it's also terrifying that this person committed most of their crimes in broad daylight. The amount of terror this would have taken on people, especially women, is practically unfathomable to me. A few weeks later, he ended up striking again, and this time his victims were 68-year-old Nina Nichols and 65-year-old Helen Blake. Both women had their lives tragically taken away from them in the same manner as Anna. Both had been strangled with stockings that were then tied around both of their necks into a bow. This would then become the assailant's signature. He wanted everyone to know that it was him, essentially cementing his new name as the Boston Strangler. This particular name would end up sticking thanks to 2 reporters named Loretta McLaughlin and Jean Cole. They had actually been keeping an eye on these crimes as they were happening, especially early on. And they were the first people to connect the dots that all of these crimes that were happening at the beginning and the ones that would happen later on were actually connected way before the police ever believed the same thing. One of the main things that Loretta actually noticed was that most of the victims wore eyeglasses, which made her wonder if this had something to do with how the assailant was choosing his victims. In August of the same year, 75-year-old Ida Erga was found passed away in her home, and just 2 days later, 65-year-old Jane Sullivan met the same fate. Several months later, in December, 21-year-old Sophie Clark was also found passed away, and she had also suffered quite a lot. She had been violated and also strangled until she passed away. At this point in Boston, there was absolute mass hysteria taking over the entire city. News reporters were talking about this day in and day out, and it didn't really help the situation because, the more people see something alarming like this on the news, the more likely they are to become afraid and almost start to panic. And a lot of these news reporters were talking to people about the types of safety precautions they were taking. Essentially, people started buying padlocks and all sorts of different locks really in bulk to the point that stores were sold out of them. People were also adopting guard dogs left and right for protection. And at one point, all of these animal shelters in the city ended up running out of dogs for adoption, which I guess is considered a good thing that all of these dogs found a new home. But it is alarming considering that's how many people were looking for additional security measures. And on top of that, it was also said that hundreds and hundreds of women ended up leaving Boston permanently because they were just way too terrified of being there at the same time that this absolute crazy person was on the loose. On New Year's Eve of 1962, Patricia Bissett, who was only 23 years old, was found deceased in her home. It was here that the Boston Strangler took a little break until March 6th, and that's when he struck again. This time it was Mary Brown, a 69-year-old woman who had also been strangled. In 1963, there were 3 more additional victims. 23-year-old Beverly Sammons, 58-year-old Evelyn Corbin, and 23-year-old Joan Graff. All sadly had met the exact same fate of being violated and then strangled by the Boston Strangler. Then finally, in January of 1964, the Boston Strangler struck for the final time. 19-year-old Mary Sullivan would be his final victim, and then suddenly the attacks stopped. At this point, police were absolutely stumped. All they knew was that there was some sicko who was deranged, that liked the attention, and that wanted people to know that it was him committing all of these crimes. But other than that, police actually knew very little about who he was. Some of their first suspicions surrounded the idea that these crimes were not linked at all because of the wide age gap between all of these women. There was a bunch of women that were much older in their 50s and 60s, and then there was a bunch of women that were also in their early 20s and even a few in their late teens. Instead, it was believed that this was the work of one person doing a lot of the initial attacks, followed by one, if not more, copycats that were taking on a lot of the younger women. After the attacks of the Boston Strangler stopped, someone new came to town. They called him the Green Man, and he was breaking into women's homes, assaulting them, but actually never took any of their lives. Police interviewed several of these women and neighbors, and they all recalled seeing a man dressed in green showing up and offering to paint their houses, except none of these people had ever booked an appointment with this particular man. Little did police know at the time that these 2 assailants would end up connecting, but that's something we'll get into a little bit later in the video. Then came an absolutely shocking confession. A man named Albert DeSalvo was arrested when he had broken into the home of a woman after pretending to be a detective when he knocked on her door. After he was finished with his brutal attack on her, he literally apologized to her and said sorry and left. The woman was completely traumatized, as would many of us be, and I'm not entirely sure what Albert thought saying sorry would really do to help the situation. But anyways, the woman was able to compose herself and ended up going straight to the police station in order to report the man. After she gave a detailed description of what this man looked like, police released a photo of him to the newspapers, which prompted several more women to come forward. All of these women ended up saying that they had also been assaulted in their own home by a man pretending to be a painter or some sort of maintenance worker, and each time he was wearing green, which ended up earning him the nickname the Green Man. Once he was in police custody, he started blurting out these absolutely insane claims that he had broken into the homes of many women and committed a lot of violations against them. He was even quoted as saying, "If you knew the whole story, you wouldn't believe it." At first, police did not believe this guy. They thought that he was probably a copycat looking for his 15 minutes of fame, and he also didn't really seem to match the description of what the Boston Strangler was, nor was there any physical evidence linking him to any of the crimes of the Boston Strangler. Following his arrest, police ended up sending him to the Bridgewater State Hospital for the criminally insane in order for him to be evaluated. It was there that Albert met another man named George Nasser, who he essentially told everything to. He would confess to George all of these tiny details and even gave him descriptions of all the women who had become victims of the Boston Strangler. These tiny little pieces of information had also been withheld from the public, which meant that the only person that would basically know this information would be the person that had committed the crime. Convinced he was telling him the absolute truth, George took all of this information and went to his own lawyer, which in turn ended up leading to Albert's public confession. About a month later, Albert and 2 other inmates ended up escaping the Bridgewater Hospital, leaving a note behind on their bunk beds. Essentially, the note said that their escape was a form of protest against the conditions the patients were forced to live in at the hospital. Fortunately, though, this was short-lived for Albert because he was just captured the next day. On March 6, 1965, Albert formally confessed to being the Boston Strangler, and to prove this, he claimed that Mary Mullen had passed away from a heart attack while he held her in his arms, which ended up being true based on her autopsy reports. He also seemed to know quite a bit about the tiny details of each of the victims. For example, he knew the color of Mary Brown's faucet, but even with this information, police still did not charge him with any of the crimes. Instead, Albert was found to be suffering from schizophrenia and was deemed to be a compulsive confessor who was desperate for attention and fame. So as for how he could have potentially known all of these tiny little details, well, police seem to have an explanation for this. They believe that because Albert was so fascinated with the work of the Boston Strangler that he would read about them in the newspaper, and he would trace down the location of a few of these victims. He would go there, and then he would somehow make his way into these apartments and look around. It was also believed that Albert had a photogenic memory, which allowed him to remember all of these tiny details. Shockingly, police also ended up turning on George Nasser. They believed that he could have possibly been in on the attacks and that he was likely the person feeding all of this information to Albert. So to resolve this, they ended up staging an identification lineup. 2 women ended up coming forward. One was a survivor of a potential Boston Strangler attack, and the other woman was a neighbor of one of the victims. In the lineup were both Albert and George, and to everyone's surprise, the women ended up pointing out George and not Albert. Although George completely denied having any involvement in this, doctors and authorities questioned him quite a bit because there was simply nothing that would rule him out of these crimes. His lawyer ended up saving his life though. Although George was an inmate and he had been arrested for committing a homicide, in that case, George had actually taken the life of someone using a gun and not stockings or nylons. So with that, police ended up turning their attention back to Albert, and doctors at the hospital ended up putting him under hypnosis to see if he could remember anything or if he would divulge any additional information. What they found out was quite informative of the internal problems and struggle that Albert was dealing with on a daily basis. It turns out that he had a history of having trouble with almost every female figure in his life. He had a lot of issues with his wife. He also had problems with his daughter, who happened to be born with a disability, and apparently this was really hard for Albert to deal with. And he also had a very strenuous relationship with his mother, who he was said to have kind of like a love-hate relationship with. And coincidentally, his mother also wore similar eyeglasses to a lot of the victims, something that Loretta McLaughlin had pointed out early on in the investigation. But with that, it ended up opening the door to more and more questions. What else was Albert hiding? What kind of life did he have? Were there any signs? But in order to answer all of that, we kind of have to go back to the beginning of Albert's life. So Albert was born on September 3rd, 1931, and almost from the very beginning, he suffered a very violent upbringing. His father was said to have been extremely abusive, not only towards him and his siblings, but also to his mother, usually beating her in front of all of the children. And at one point, his father was even said to have sold Albert and all of his siblings to some stranger. As an older child, Albert would start to hurt animals and he would start to carry out petty crimes, which eventually ended up leading to him committing battery and robbery by the time he was only 12 years old. Eventually, Albert did grow up and he ended up joining the military and was transferred to Germany. That's where he ended up meeting his future wife. He got married and also had 2 children of his own. Unfortunately, all of this structure did not prevent him from acting out in violent and inappropriate ways to the point where he was discharged from the military and then sent back to the USA. When they did move back to America from Germany with his entire family, Albert had earned a new nickname, the Measuring Man. He would smooth talk his way into women's homes, pretending to be a scout for fashion models. Once these women would fall for his words, they would let him into their apartment and he would start measuring them almost as if he were conducting like a fitting or to make sure that these women were up to the model standards. But then at the same time, while he was doing all of this, he would also fondle all of these women. Eventually, he was reported though, and he was caught, arrested, and sent to prison, but he was only sentenced to 1 year in prison. Eventually, later on, Albert would return back to prison, but this time it would not be for the crimes committed by the Boston Strangler. Although there was some circumstantial evidence that pointed in his direction, police just didn't have enough proof to say that it was 100% him. What they did find him guilty of were the separate crimes of the Green Man, which was thanks to that one woman who was able to go down to the police station and report him right away. Then in 1967, Albert was sentenced to life in prison, but that's not where the story ends. There are a few more twists here. About 8 years later, in 1973, Albert made a phone call from prison to his former psychiatrist. He told her that he wanted to tell her the real story, but he didn't give her any detail. He also apparently called a reporter and told him the exact same thing. Unfortunately, before Albert was able to reveal whatever information he was hiding, he had been stabbed and lost his life in prison by 3 other inmates. Almost immediately, it was widely suspected that Albert had been silenced on purpose. When police searched his jail cell, they discovered an interesting piece of information. There was a collection of poems found, all written by Albert, and one of them referred to the Boston Strangler. This is what it said. Here's the story of the Strangler yet untold. The man who claims he murdered 13 women, young and old. Today he sits in a prison cell, deep inside only a secret he can tell. People everywhere are still in doubt. Is the Strangler in prison or roaming about? In my opinion, this poem just adds to all of the confusion that everyone was experiencing. One moment you think it is Albert, and the next moment it kind of puts enough doubt in your head to make you wonder if it was truly him. Plenty of people were extremely uncertain about what the truth was here. They were essentially left wondering whether or not the culprit was off the streets or whether he was still lurking in the shadows of Boston. After that, the case went cold. All authorities could do at this point was hope that new information would come forward or that technology would improve so they can carry out further investigations. It would be decades before DNA testing became available, and in 2001, it was finally put to the test. Investigators exhumed the body of Albert in order to test DNA evidence that they had found on Mary Sullivan's body. And surprisingly, it did not match Albert. As you can imagine, this left everyone completely stunned and with a lot more questions than answers. In 2013, technology had improved a lot more. And again, Albert's DNA was tested this time, but this time it was tested against Albert's nephew. He had actually thrown away an empty pop bottle and then police had retrieved it from the trash. And this is what ended up being tested. And surprisingly, it ended up being a very close match to the DNA found on Mary Sullivan. This was enough evidence for authorities to get a court order in order to be able to exhume Albert's body one more time. When they tested Albert's own DNA against the DNA found on Mary Sullivan, this time it ended up being a match. You would think that this would be enough evidence to close this case and convince everyone that Albert had been fully responsible, but that's not how this went. Right away, Albert's family started claiming that even though it might have been a match, it does not prove that he was the one responsible for taking Mary Sullivan's life. All it really did was confirm that he had been in the crime scene at one point or another, not necessarily responsible for taking her life. Additionally, even if he had been responsible for committing this crime against Mary, it only proved or suggested that he was the one responsible for that particular crime and not for the other 12 crimes committed by the Boston Strangler. But there's also one more twist. Mary's own family was also not convinced that Albert was responsible. In fact, Mary's own sister believed that it was Mary's abusive ex-boyfriend that could have potentially been responsible. The thing that made her believe that it could have been him was a certain gift that Mary would always get her ex-boyfriend. He had a thing for ascots, which are like these small silk or satin scarves for men. And coincidentally, one of these was found all cut up inside of Mary's toilet. So this led Mary's sister to believe that he could have potentially been responsible or was at least in the apartment at that time. Another witness ended up coming forward who happened to be Mary's neighbor. He said that he had seen a man in Mary's apartment the day that she had lost her life. And this man, the description that they gave, ended up resembling Mary's roommate's boyfriend. The point here that they were trying to make was that this man essentially had access to Mary's apartment via her roommate and likely had a key. And to make matters more suspicious, Mary had apparently lost her key to the apartment the day before the crime. Of course, police went and interviewed this man and they gave him a lie detector test as well, which proved his answers to be untruthful. Which, if you know a little bit about true crime or a lot, you know that lie detector tests are heavily debated. A lot of people don't seem to trust them. And they're not allowed in courts as well because they're deemed to be too unreliable. After Albert was arrested, though, all of the attention was taken away from all of these other potential suspects. An investigation into them was completely halted because at this point, Albert had essentially stolen the spotlight. And ever since then, the public has remained absolutely divided about whether or not Albert was truly the Boston Strangler. So was it him or was it not? Let me know what you guys think. As for my opinion, I am kind of leaning towards him being the Boston Strangler. There's a lot of evidence that puts him in that direction, but this case was a long time ago, and I wish I could see a little bit more evidence to do a little bit more of a deeper dive into what actually happened. You know, a lot of this information is quite old, so it's not easily accessible at this point, but let me know what you guys think. Was Albert DeSalvo the Boston Strangler, or do you think it was someone else, or do you think it was just a bunch of other people copying each other? Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Thank you so much for joining me, and if you guys want more crime, creepy, and unbelievable content, don't forget to check out my TikTok, same username at HeebieJeebiesTV, and I will see you guys in the next video.